friends, dear truth seekers. This time I would like to review the book Gems of Dominion Volume 7, Blood at Untersberg Mountain. In Volume 7 of the series Gems of Dominion, Stan Wolf describes how it came to a Red River after an explosion at the Untersberg Mountain. Stan Wolf claims that this was done by Dr. Hans Kammler and his soldiers, but the local news states that this was a normal natural event. So in the local news it is claimed that this is a natural process that part of the mountain just fell, whereas Stan Wolf says that this was done by General Hans Kammler and his soldiers. Stan Wolf states in the books that the books are partly based in fiction and partly based in truth. What is true and what is untrue, everybody has to decide for himself. We will first watch a summary of the first 6 books. In Volume 1 of the series, Stan Wolf describes how he experienced a time anomaly at the Untersberg. He meets General Hans Kammler, who had a station built at Untersberg by the end of the war. Dr. Kammler explains to Stan that the flow of time in Untersberg is 300 times slower than out here. Stan Wolf then gets an order from Dr. Kammler to fly to Fuerteventura to get some valuable crystals. The book ends with the blasting of the entrance to Dr. Kammler's base. In Volume 2, Stan Wolf travels to the past by means of a time corridor or portal. He travels to the year 1776 from Salzburg and sees there how the young Mozart works. Stan Wolf also makes a journey through a time corridor into a potential future. There he sees flying discs in the sky. In Volume 2, Stan Wolf describes how he is invited to the station of Kammler to see the zero-point generator. The zero-point generator has been suppressed by the satanic elites since the time of Nikola Tesla. After the global turning, all these technologies will be available worldwide. The book ends with a quotation from the goddess Sekhmet. In Volume 3, Stan Wolf is shown the station's energy room, and Dr. Kammler says that if he were to recreate it, the energy cartels would very quickly eliminate him. Dr. Kammler says that all these devices will be available worldwide after the global turning. A little later, Dr. Kammler shows Stan Wolf the chronovisor or chronoscope. With the chronoscope you can see the past. Stan Wolf looks through the chronoscope and sees the past of Salzburg, from the steam train around 1920 to the war and troop movements around 1945. Dr. Kammler says that time travel can change history significantly, only small changes can be made to the timelines. The shadow government owns chronoscopes itself and uses these devices for its own benefit. After the global turning and in the new golden age, everybody will be able to see the past with chronoscopes. Stan Wolf at the end of the book holds an Isis ritual of the Isis ring at the Untersberg Mountain. In Volume 4 of Gems of Dominion, the Golden Sphere at the Untersberg Mountain, Stan Wolf describes a journey to base 3 of the RDs in the distant past. He goes through the time portal and finds himself on an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Here the RDs live with zero-point energy and wireless energy. All equipment and transportation get free energy. The inhabitants of Base 3 have everything they need to live and are completely autonomous in energy and food. Most of the people here work in research, the guide says to Wolf. The island is protected by a force field to ward off any potential intruder. Stan Wolf also writes about another writer who published a similar story in the book The 9 Unknowns about the Untersberg Mountain. Dr. Kammler admits that he had already contacted someone else to make the story public. At the end of the book, Stan Wolf sees the golden ball at the Untersberg Mountain. In Volume 5 of Gems of Dominion, Darkness Under the Sign of the Cross, Stan Wolf writes about the witch persecutions in the Middle Ages and in the modern era. Because of his criticism of the church, Stan Wolf's company went bankrupt. He mentions in the book the Hexenkartothek, the research project of the Third Reich about the witch burnings. He further writes in the book that he went through a dimensional portal and went ashore in Argentina with 2 guard soldiers from the station. Stan Wolf says that there are many portals around the world and that in theory anyone could walk through them. The shadow government knows about these portals or stargates and uses it to their advantage. Furthermore, Stan Wolf tells about the 12 churches at Untersberg Mountain, which apparently should not exist. He describes beautiful churches and cathedrals with time anomalies. In Volume 6 of the series, Stan Wolf describes how he is invited to the headquarters of the Imperial Germans. He goes through a dimensional gate and finds himself in a base of the Imperial Germans where soldiers monitor the events on Earth. Dr. Kammler says that they are watching everything and preparing for the upheaval. Stan Wolf also describes how he flies with Claudia to Mauritius to swim with dolphins. He describes the relics and peoples he encountered during his travels. The general says that more and more people will resist the enviable tyranny, and that this is part of the upheaval or the global turning. I reviewed the first 5 books of Stan Wolf. If you know German, check it out. I also did an interview with Wolfgang Stadler or Stan Wolf. So in Volume 7 of the series Gems of Dominion, Stan Wolf meets up with Dr. Hans Kammler and the Illuminati to talk about the different timelines. He talks to Becker about the so-called time experiments in the Third Reich. Becker says that he comes from a second parallel timeline and that he lives in a peaceful world. This would also become the future of our timeline after the Great Upheaval. He thinks that the Great Upheaval of the world will happen soon, and that the satanic elites will be disempowered. We will now read a chapter of the book. Chapter 32. The Timelines. Since more and more signs piled up which pointed to an imminent upheaval, Wolf wanted to contact the Illuminati again. He had shown him various future scenarios, but these were by no means clear statements. Wolf would have wished more clarity about the way the upheaval would take place, and also the time when it would take place. So he called Becker, and as is usually the case, a short-term appointment was arranged. This time again in the Untersberg forest, very close to where he had met the Illuminati for the first time. It was afternoon and mild weather, when Wolf walked away along the forest. He still remembered well when he had come here many years ago in almost complete darkness to meet Becker. At that time he had taken his police pistol, because he could not have known what would await him in the dark forest. He had to laugh inwardly when he imagined the situation back then, as he fearfully made his way along the dark forest path. But now it was bright and the sun was shining through the trees. It smelled of pine needles and moss, as he came to the curve behind which the military firing range began. Today he didn't have to worry about being chased away by a patrolling guard, as he had when he and Linda had discovered the cave with the writer's manuscript. Long ago, this firing range had been closed. National defense had apparently ceased to be considered important. Everything lay peacefully at the door of the Untersberg. There he saw already the Illuminati from far on a tree trunk which lay at the wayside. Becker smiled when he saw Wolf. He stood up and greeted him with a handshake. Of course he knew in advance what Wolf wanted from him, and after two of them had made themselves comfortable on the tree trunk he began. The how, where and when of this upheaval will take place, as I've already told you, is not yet certain. But you wanted to ask me something about the black goo and crystals, didn't you? Before Wolf could even answer, Becker continued. Remember how I once told you that you can locate dimensional gates with the crystal from Oniye, and also remember the green stone I gave you, which overrides the mind control effects of intelligence agencies, and also makes it possible to intercept radio communications. These are not magical forces which are at work here. No, these are just the properties of minerals unknown to most people. You can influence with stones very many things and even more with crystals, even the psyche of people. But you already know that as a Rosicrucian. Wolf understood what the Illuminati wanted to say to him with it. The latter continued. You also wanted to know why I would not be affected by changes in the future, and why I need not to fear to cease to exist all at once. Yes, Wolf replied. It would be a paradox if something were to happen in the present, which could call your existence into question. At our last meeting I already told you that I would explain this matter to you. In 1943, German researchers made a breakthrough, which can probably be described as the most tremendous event in history. It had become possible for them to create a new timeline, a so-called parallel world, which occurred until then only in science fiction novels. But the most important thing was that it was also possible for them to switch back and forth between these timelines. Now Wolf was completely overwhelmed. He had heard such a statement so far only from Apollo, but he had always dismissed such things as drivel. And now Becker was talking about it too. What are you saying? Groaned Wolf, irritated. And I come from the second newly created timeline. That's why a serious change in your possible future can't do anything to me. As you can now imagine, a different future ran, or rather runs in the second timeline, and thus a different present as well. However, I don't want to overcharge you with the details of this matter, but at least I can tell you that these people have managed to live in a better world, even if you can hardly imagine such a thing. So you're then also able to switch between these two timelines? Asked Wolf. Yes, of course, Becker said. That's why it's possible for me to give you advice and impulses that lead in the direction of a positive future in your timeline. We can observe exactly how much in the present certain groupings try to exercise power at any price. However, this would become a fiasco in which humanity would ultimately have to perish. Can't we all cross into the second timeline? Asked Wolf. Theoretically, yes, replied Becker. But then it could happen that some of you would exist double. Now it was absolutely too much for Wolf. What was this Illuminati, who wasn't really one, talking about? He now needed a break to process the whole thing. Becker too noticed that Wolf had now learned more than he could process at the moment, so he said, The most important thing in the present situation, however, is to make people aware of the situation and to focus them on Untersberg. Not fear of any consequences of the upheaval, but confidence should spread among the people. This will lead to an emergence of a future, as I've shown you as the variant from the Untersberg. The two had now been sitting on the tree trunk in the forest for more than an hour. Wolf thanked Becker, said goodbye, and prepared to leave. He had now enough information from the Illuminati, which needed to be processed first. Becker states that parallel timelines exist, and that by the experiment of the Bell 1943 in the Third Reich, a second timeline was created. He also says that he comes from the second timeline, and that he cannot be influenced by possible paradoxes that occur within our own timeline. He also says that it is possible that Stan Wolf exists double in the other timeline. I have already discussed the existence of parallel universes in my Star Trek series. Feel free to check them out. We will now read for another chapter of the book.
Chapter 34. The creation of the new timeline. Surprisingly, Becker could not be reached in this time, so Wolf turned to the general. Instead, he established a connection with the Obersturmbannführer Weber via the new communication channel. When he simply answered him when he asked what it was about the timelines, came the curt reply, "You'll be told in a moment." After several hours, Weber relayed to him a secret meeting place where he could speak to the general alone. "General," Wolf began. "In the meantime, I have been informed about the creation of a new timeline in the Third Reich. My question to you is short and sweet. Do you also belong to this new timeline, and are you able to switch from it to our timeline at any time?" Kammler was not prepared for this question. He looked at Wolf penetratingly, as if he were studying every movement of his counterpart. Then he began, "I underestimated you, but obviously you have very powerful friends, because I can hardly imagine how else you came up with the timeline thing." He pondered for a while and then continued, "Yes, I know about the creation of this new timeline, of course, but that has never been a topic at our meetings until now. There was a top-secret experiment in the Reich in 1943. This one went over my desk, so to speak. Something went wrong, then as things got out of hand. And it began with the fact that in the experiments with the bell, the gravity and thus also time should be changed. I do not want to burden you with the physical details. Just imagine a black hole as it occurs in space. In it, an infinitely dense mass develops and the time shrinks against zero, a so-called singularity. There is no time, so to speak." Wolf was astonished what he got to hear here from Dr. Kammler. The last time he had heard something similar had been years ago, when he and Claudia had come through the ancient iron door in the church in the mountains, directly into a very large monastery church on the Untersberg, where a monk had told him that there was no time here. The general continued, "Of course this was not a real black hole, as they exist in the vastness of the universe. It was much weaker and smaller, but it was enough to make some of our physicists disappear. But not only that, the experiment got a momentum of its own. The bell, which was connected with heavy cables to its own power plant, surrounded itself with a blue glow, broke loose, rose up, and finally disappeared before our own eyes. Some of the physicists lay dead and half burnt on the floor. Others were unresponsive and later declared insane. There was a smell of burnt cables and ozone. Some, however, remained gone with the bell. That was the beginning of a new timeline, as we learned later." "Where did the bell disappear to with the people?" was Wolf's question. "It reappeared in another timeline, as did the surviving physicists. These people were then also later able to switch between these timelines. What exactly happened then, we still don't know. We were able to reproduce this experiment, and it seemed as if we had succeeded in creating such a black hole in modified miniature. Somewhere in the secrecy, however, there was a weak point, because the Americans had learned of our attempts at the time and also began to experiment at full speed. In October 1943, the Eldridge, a US Navy destroyer, disappeared in the Philadelphia harbor, killing many of its crew, just as we did. Also, this ship, and with its many crew members, might have changed between the timelines. Whether the Americans then still pursued the timeline exploration is beyond my knowledge. For us, it was important to have a new starting point, and we then used this timeline to build a better world for us. Do you remember when we took you with Linda to base number 3 to Atlantis? That base also in the other timeline?" Wolf paused. "Are you saying that Linda and I were actually in a parallel world back then? Would that be so bad for you?" asked Kammler. "As you saw for yourself, you couldn't notice any difference at all when you crossed over into the other timeline." Wolf had to agree with him. Nevertheless, even now in retrospect, it was outrageous to him that he had been with Linda outside of our usual time. To the individual, it felt no different than coming to another place. He might not even realize that he's actually in a different world. We have now refined these crossing portals and provided them with sophisticated technology. Deaths, as they were back in 1943, have long since ceased to occur. In the meantime, we can set exactly the time and place we want to go to. The entrances to our stations also work on this principle. There, where the water flows over the water, or in the forest above the old border crossing, also high on the Brunntal on the north side of Untersberg, at the old tin door, where you had your first contact with Weber, these are all crossing points into this other timeline. The fact that time passes about 300 times slower there in the mountain has to do with something else again, but I don't consider that important right now. "Yes," Wolf replied, now beginning to understand some things. "Your present scientific world is not yet able to move into the other timelines. This research has never really been pushed, so there's never been any serious conflict. Can you imagine what that means for us?" Wolf nodded. "You've become virtually untouchable," he said. "And yet there are also efforts on our part to reunite these timelines, at least in part, but this is to be done only after the Great Purge, after the upheaval. Have I been able to satisfy your curiosity with these explanations?" Wolf had enough of the general for the time being to take some time to process these news.
So the basic message of the books of Stan Wolf is the following. that the Imperial Germans have bases all around the world and in other timelines, and that they've been preparing since years for the final conflict and the great upheaval. As I've said in many of my videos, like the videos of the Sina van Rensburg, General Hans Kammler says that the upheaval will be violent, and that more and more people will rebel against the true rulers. He says that this is part of the global turning already taking place. The general says that stones and crystals have certain properties, and that through a black gemstone, he could slow down the time flow at the station up to 300 times. This means that 1 day at the station equals to 300 days outside. This allowed him to spend over 70 years in under 3 months. So 1 day for the general equals to 300 days for us, or almost 1 whole year. The Imperial Germans will help liberate the world during Judgment Day. Well, I hope you found this video informative. Don't forget to rate and subscribe and hit the bell button. And if you can make a small donation, the details are in the description. Many greetings from outer space and cheers!